New York City, 2000. A legendary high-fashion agency prepares to launch its newest star, a 19-year-old black model named Simone. Days before her debut, she vanishes. The agency owner, the powerful Mr. Armand, spins a tale of relapse and runaway dreams. A week later, a stunningly lifelike mannequin named Simone appears in his private, locked atelier. For 20 years, it stands there, an icon of haunting realism, its presence masked by the scent of chemicals Armand claims are for preserving vintage leather. Then, in 2020, Armand dies. The agency's longtime janitor, Franklin, tasked with clearing the atelier, makes a horrifying discovery. An accidental slip reveals a hidden scar, and the truth about the mannequin unravels a 20-year-old secret, exposing a dark obsession hidden in plain sight. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear this. Stories like this, stories hidden behind glamour and power, often get lost. They only find the light because you choose to listen. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're joining from and what time it is where you are. Your presence here matters as we uncover what was kept silent for so long. Now, let me tell you the story. The year 2000 pulsed with the frantic, aspirational energy of high fashion, and nowhere was that pulse stronger than within the stark white, minimalist walls of Armand Models. Housed in a sprawling top-floor loft in a cast-iron Soho building, the agency wasn't just a business, it was an institution, a gatekeeper to the glittering, ephemeral world of runways and magazine covers. Presiding over it all was the man whose name was synonymous with discovering beauty, Mr. Armand. Armand was a figure of almost mythical proportions in the industry. Enigmatic, rarely seen outside his inner sanctum, he was known for his unerring eye, his demanding perfectionism, and his almost Svengali-like control over the careers he chose to cultivate. He didn't just find models, he sculpted them, transforming raw potential into iconic images. His word could launch 1,000 campaigns. His disapproval could end a career before it began. The agency was his kingdom, a gilded cage where beauty was both worshipped and rigorously controlled. Moving silently through the background of this high-stakes world was Franklin. He had started working as a janitor at Armand Models back when disco was king and Soho was still gritty, long before it became the playground of the ultra-rich. Now in his late 50s, Franklin was a fixture. A quiet, observant presence who saw everything and said little. He had watched generations of hopeful young faces pass through these halls, seen dreams realized and, more often, brutally crushed. He knew the agency's rhythms, its secrets, the faint cracks beneath its polished, glamorous facade. He polished the floors, emptied the trash, replaced the light bulbs, his work a steady, necessary counterpoint to the chaotic, often cruel, pursuit of ephemeral beauty. He was invisible, and in that invisibility, he saw more than anyone. The agency in 2000 was at the peak of its influence. Its models graced every major magazine cover, walked every important runway from New York to Milan. The pressure was immense. The loft buzzed with the constant jangle of phones, the staccato click of camera shutters, the low murmur of agents making deals. It was a place of high stakes, intense competition, and fragile egos, all orchestrated by the unseen hand of Mr. Armand from his private office suite at the far end of the loft. Franklin watched it all, his expression impassive, his thoughts his own, just doing his job, keeping the stage clean for the next act in Armand's long-running drama. Into this high-pressure, high-fashion crucible stepped Simone. She was 19 years old, fresh from Harlem, possessing a rare combination of striking, angular beauty and a quiet, almost ethereal grace. She moved with the natural elegance of a dancer, her gaze direct and intelligent. She wasn't just another pretty face. There was a depth to her, a sense of self-possession that set her apart from the other, often desperately eager, young women who filled the agency's waiting rooms. Mr. Armand saw her potential immediately. It was more than potential. It was, in his eyes, perfection. He summoned her to his private office, a rare occurrence for a new face, and the agency buzzed with speculation. When Simone emerged an hour later, looking slightly dazed but resolute, The word spread like wildfire. Armand had found his new muse. This designation was both a golden ticket and a heavy burden. It meant Simone was catapulted from the anonymous pool of new faces directly into the agency's stratosphere. She was given the best photographers, the most exclusive castings, the direct, obsessive attention of Armand himself. He oversaw every detail of her transformation, her portfolio, her walk, even her diet. He spoke of her in hushed, reverent tones to magazine editors and designers, building an aura of mystique around her even before her first major appearance. Franklin watched Simone navigate this sudden, dizzying ascent with a quiet admiration. Unlike many of the other young models, who seemed consumed by the industry's often toxic demands, Simone retained a core of quiet strength. She was focused, professional, and kind to the staff, including Franklin, whom she always greeted with a warm, genuine smile. He noticed the small things about her, the way she carried a well-worn book of poetry in her bag, the way she would sometimes stand by the large loft windows, gazing out at the city skyline with a thoughtful, almost melancholy expression. He also noticed a small, distinctive crescent-shaped scar just behind her left ear, visible only when she pulled her hair back, a tiny human imperfection in the face Armand was marketing as flawless. Armand's focus on Simone intensified as the weeks went by, bordering on possessive. He dictated her schedule, controlled her appearances, seemed almost jealous of any attention she received that wasn't filtered through him. He spoke of protecting her, of shielding her from the industry's corrupting influences. To the outside world, it looked like mentorship, albeit an intense one. To Franklin, who had seen Armand's obsessive patterns before, it felt different. It felt like ownership. Simone, meanwhile, seemed determined but increasingly weary, the initial excitement in her eyes sometimes replaced by a shadow of anxiety. She was on the verge of international stardom, her debut at Paris Fashion Week just weeks away, the culmination of Armand's meticulous planning. She was his creation, his muse, poised for flight. The week before Paris Fashion Week was a blur of frantic energy at Armand Models. Final fittings, press schedules, travel arrangements. The entire agency was focused on launching Simone onto the global stage. She was the one, the next supermodel, the embodiment of Armand's genius. The pressure on her was unimaginable. Then, 3 days before her scheduled flight, Simone didn't show up for a crucial fitting with a major designer. Calls to her cell phone went straight to voicemail. A frantic check of her small apartment revealed nothing amiss. Her bags were partially packed. Her passport lay on the dresser. She had simply vanished. Panic rippled through the agency. Missed fittings were unprofessional. Disappearing entirely was career suicide. But this felt different. Simone wasn't flaky or unreliable. Theories flew. Had she been poached by a rival agency? Had she simply cracked under the pressure? Mr. Armand remained sequestered in his office, issuing no statements. The silence from his suite only amplified the anxiety. Finally, after 24 hours of frantic speculation and unanswered calls, he summoned the entire agency staff. Agents, bookers, stylists, assistants, even Franklin, who was polishing the floor nearby, to the main showroom. Armand stood before them, his usually immaculate composure replaced by a mask of profound, theatrical sorrow. His eyes were red-rimmed, his voice thick with emotion. He told them the news he claimed to have just received from Simone's estranged family. "It is with the deepest regret," he began, his voice breaking slightly, "that I must inform you, Simone will not be going to Paris. It seems the pressures, the temptations of this world, became too much for her." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "She has relapsed. Her family believes she has run away, perhaps back to old destructive habits. They haven't heard from her either." He painted a vivid, tragic picture of a brilliant talent consumed by personal demons, a young woman who had tragically, foolishly, thrown away the golden future he had so carefully crafted for her. He spoke of his own heartbreak, his feeling of failure as her mentor. "We tried to protect her," he said, his voice a low, sorrowful whisper. "But some souls, Some are just too fragile for the light. It was a masterful performance. He deflected any potential blame from the agency or himself, instead framing Simone's disappearance as a sad, inevitable consequence of her own inherent flaws. The narrative was set. Simone, the fallen muse, the cautionary tale. Her name, once whispered with excitement, was now spoken with pity and a hint of judgment. Her disappearance wasn't treated as a potential crime, not even officially reported as a missing person case beyond a cursory internal inquiry. It was simply a tragic footnote in the fast-moving, forgetful world of fashion. Armand had authored the story, and the industry, eager for the next sensation, accepted it without question. Simone, the person, vanished. Simone, the legend of wasted potential, was born. A week after Simone's disappearance had been neatly packaged and filed away as a tragic cautionary tale, Mr. Armand summoned his most trusted senior staff, his head booker, his chief stylist, his longtime financial manager, to his private atelier. This room, located in a remote, quiet corner of the sprawling loft, was Armand's inner sanctum, a place few were ever granted access to. It was a large, climate-controlled space, kept meticulously cool and dark, lined with archival-quality wardrobes containing his legendary collection of vintage haute couture, priceless gowns worn by screen sirens and forgotten duchesses. It was a room dedicated to the preservation of beauty, a temple to Armand's unique, obsessive aesthetic. Franklin, whose duties included the weekly, careful cleaning of this space, knew the routine. He unlocked the heavy insulated door and propped it open, letting the cool, chemically scented air wash out into the hallway as he gathered his specialized cleaning supplies. He saw the small group gather outside, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and trepidation. An audience with Armand in the atelier was a rare, and usually significant, event. When Armand finally emerged from his adjacent office, his earlier grief seemed to have been replaced by a strange, almost feverish excitement. He ushered the small group inside, pulling the heavy door shut behind them, leaving Franklin alone in the hallway. Franklin lingered, ostensibly organizing his cart, his curiosity piqued by the hushed, reverent tones he could hear filtering from under the door. He heard Armand's voice, low and theatrical. "As you know," Armand was saying, "we suffered a great loss last week, a loss of potential, of beauty. But art endures. Art can capture what life lets slip away." There was a pause, then the sound of a heavy velvet drape being pulled aside. Franklin heard gasps, hushed exclamations of incredible. "My God, it looks just like her." After a few minutes, the door opened, and the small group emerged, their faces a mixture of awe and a faint, lingering unease. Armand stood in the doorway, a strange, proprietary smile on his face. "Franklin," he called, gesturing him inside. "Come see." Franklin stepped into the cool, dim room. In the center, where the velvet drape had been pulled back, stood a new display platform, and on it, bathed in the soft glow of a single spotlight, stood a mannequin. But it was unlike any mannequin Franklin had ever seen. It was dressed in a stunning, vintage Dior gown from Armand's collection. Its posture was perfect, its form impossibly lifelike, and its face was Simone. The likeness was not just accurate, it was absolute. Every subtle plane of her face, the precise curve of her lips, the intelligent, slightly distant gaze in the custom-made glass eyes, it was her. It was Simone, frozen in a state of perfect, unnerving stillness. "A tribute," Armand said softly, his eyes fixed on the figure with an intensity that bordered on worship. "A custom piece, commissioned some time ago, ironically, to capture her essence before. We shall call her Simone, a reminder of the perfection that was, and the perfection that endures, in art." Franklin stared at the figure, a cold, heavy feeling settling in his stomach. The realism was breathtaking, yes, but it was also deeply, profoundly disturbing. It didn't feel like a tribute. It felt like a possession, like a golem, like a man who, having lost his creation in life, had decided to keep her, perfect and unchanging, forever. The unveiling of the Simone mannequin marked a subtle shift in the atmosphere surrounding Mr. Armand and his private atelier. The figure became an object of fascination within the agency, a symbol of both Armand's artistic obsession and the tragic story of the real Simone. Access to the atelier remained strictly limited, but the mannequin's presence was a known, if slightly unsettling, fact of life at Armand Models. For Franklin, however, the atelier, and the figure it housed, became a source of quiet, persistent dread. His duties required him to enter the room once a week, usually on a quiet Monday morning before the agency's frantic pace kicked into high gear. He was the only person, besides Armand himself, who possessed a key. This exclusivity felt less like a privilege and more like a burden. He hated cleaning that room. The cool, dim, climate-controlled air always felt unnaturally still, heavy. The rows of priceless vintage gowns hanging in their archival bags felt like silent, judgmental ghosts. And in the center, under its soft spotlight, the Simone mannequin stood, its lifelike gaze seeming to follow him as he moved around the room. But it wasn't just the figure itself that unnerved him. It was the smell. From the day the mannequin had been installed, the room had carried a faint but distinct chemical odor. It was sharp, slightly sweet, and vaguely medicinal, completely unlike the usual scents of fabric, dust, and old perfume that permeated the rest of the agency's storage areas. Franklin, whose nose was attuned to the subtle olfactory landscape of the building, noticed it immediately. He mentioned it to Armand once, expressing concern that perhaps something was wrong with the climate control system or that some cleaning solvent had spilled. Armand had waved off his concern with a casual, almost bored air. "Oh, that," he'd said, sniffing the air theatrically. "It's just some experimental chemicals I'm using on the vintage leather pieces. New preservation techniques. Very cutting edge. Highly volatile, though, so best not to disturb anything, Franklin. Just do your usual dusting." The explanation seemed plausible. In the eccentric, often bizarre world of high fashion, where couture garments were treated with the reverence and obsessive care usually reserved for religious artifacts, experimenting with strange chemicals for leather preservation didn't seem entirely out of the realm of possibility. Franklin, having no expertise in couture conservation, accepted the explanation, though the smell continued to bother him. It didn't smell like leather. It smelled different, sharper, more persistent. He learned to work quickly in the atelier, his movements efficient, his focus deliberately kept away from the mannequin in the center of the room. He would dust the shelves, vacuum the plush carpet, empty the small waste bin, all while trying to breathe shallowly, to ignore the lingering chemical scent that seemed to cling to the back of his throat. He just wanted to get in, do his job, and get out. The room felt wrong. The mannequin felt wrong. And the smell felt like a secret he didn't want to understand. The years flowed by, measured in the changing hemlines and fleeting trends of the fashion world. Seasons turned into years, years into a decade, then nearly two. Armand Models continued its reign, though perhaps the intense, feverish peak of 2000 had softened into a more established, institutional kind of prestige. Models came and went, their careers burning brightly for a season or two before fading. Agents and bookers moved on to other agencies or started their own. The industry, by its very nature, was one of constant, relentless flux. But through it all, two constants remained. Mr. Armand, growing older, more reclusive, more eccentric, ruling his kingdom from his inner sanctum, and Franklin, the janitor, a silent, steady presence navigating the background of the agency's glamorous chaos. Franklin's weekly cleaning of the atelier became a strange, unchanging ritual in his long tenure. Every Monday morning, he would unlock the heavy, insulated door, prop it open briefly to air out the persistent chemical smell, and step into the cool, dim, silent room. The rows of vintage gowns remained, their plastic coverings yellowing slightly with age, and in the center, under its spotlight, the Simone mannequin stood, eternally 19, forever poised on the brink of a future that had never arrived. He rarely looked directly at it anymore. He had learned to clean around it, his movements practiced, his gaze averted. But sometimes, his eyes would snag on a detail, The impossible realism of the hands clasped loosely at its side, the faint, almost imperceptible texture of the skin on its neck, the custom-made glass eyes that seemed to hold a profound, ancient sadness. The figure didn't age, didn't change, but Franklin did. He saw his own reflection sometimes in the polished floor around its base, his hair graying, his shoulders stooping slightly, a stark contrast to the mannequin's frozen youth. His relationship with the room, and the object it contained, was complex. He still believed Armand's story about the leather preservation chemicals, though the smell never truly faded, sometimes seeming stronger after Armand had spent one of his long, solitary afternoons locked inside. Franklin didn't think of the mannequin as Simone, the vibrant young woman he remembered. He thought of it as Armand's sick shrine, a grotesque, obsessive tribute to a lost muse. It was creepy, yes, morbid, certainly, but his mind, trained by decades of minding his own business, never made the leap to the truly unthinkable. He was the janitor. His job was to clean, to maintain order, not to question the eccentricities of his powerful, enigmatic boss. He heard the whispers over the years, the new assistants and interns who would speculate about the locked room and the legendary mannequin inside. He heard the stories that had solidified into industry lore. Simone, the tragic beauty who couldn't handle the pressure. He never corrected them. He never shared his own quiet unease, the feeling that the mannequin was more than just a realistic sculpture, the way the chemical smell seemed too sharp, too persistent. It was a burden, this weekly ritual, this proximity to Armand's strange obsession. But it was a silent burden, carried alone, locked away like the room itself. He just kept cleaning, kept polishing, kept maintaining the facade, waiting for the day he could finally retire and leave the ghosts of Armand models behind him. 20 years. An entire generation. In the fast-paced, disposable world of fashion, 20 years is an eternity. Trends flared and died. Supermodels rose and fell. Magazines folded. Designers came and went. But at Armand Models, the core elements remained stubbornly, almost unnaturally, unchanged. Mr. Armand, now a man in his late 70s, had become even more of a recluse. He rarely attended fashion shows or industry events, preferring to rule his empire remotely, his pronouncements delivered through his senior agents like edicts from an unseen king. His legend grew, fueled by his absence, his eccentricity burnished into an aura of untouchable genius. He was the Karl Lagerfeld, the Yves Saint Laurent of his domain, a figure whose past glories overshadowed his present-day relevance, but whose name still commanded respect and fear. Franklin, the janitor, had crossed the threshold into his 70s. His steps were slower, his back a little stiffer, but his routine remained the same. He was the agency's institutional memory, the man who knew where the bodies were buried, figuratively speaking. He had outlasted dozens of agents, hundreds of models. He was part of the furniture, a silent, reliable fixture in a world defined by its transience. And in the locked, climate-controlled atelier, the Simone mannequin stood, unchanged, untouched by the passage of time. It had become an icon in its own right, a whispered legend within the fashion world. Young designers made pilgrimages to the agency, hoping for a rare glimpse of the hauntingly realistic figure. Fashion historians wrote articles speculating about its mysterious origins, praising its unparalleled artistry. It was listed in the agency's assets as a priceless, unique sculpture, insured for a small fortune. Its fame, in a strange, macabre way, eclipsed the memory of the young woman it was supposed to represent. Simone, the model, was a forgotten cautionary tale. Simone, the mannequin, was a work of art. The chemical smell in the atelier persisted, a faint but constant reminder of Armand's leather preservation techniques. No one questioned it anymore. It was just part of the room's strange, unique atmosphere. Franklin continued his weekly cleanings, his unease about the room and its silent occupant having long ago settled into a kind of weary, resigned acceptance. It was just another part of the job, another of Mr. Armand's many eccentricities, that you learned not to question if you wanted to keep your position. The silence surrounding the mannequin, like the silence surrounding the real Simone's disappearance, had become absolute. A 20-year-old status quo that seemed as permanent and unchanging as the figure itself. The end of Armand's reign came not with a dramatic collapse, but with a quiet, undignified silence. On a Tuesday morning in the spring of 2020, Mr. Armand failed to emerge from his private office suite. This was not entirely unusual. He often kept erratic hours. But when his noon meeting came and went, his longtime personal assistant grew concerned. Using her master key, she let herself into his inner office. She found him slumped in his large leather chair behind his antique desk, a cup of cold coffee beside him, his eyes closed, his face peaceful. He had suffered a massive, fatal heart attack sometime during the night, alone in the opulent sanctuary he had built for himself. The news of Mr. Armand's death sent immediate shockwaves through the fashion industry. Tributes poured in from designers, photographers, and former models whose careers he had launched. He was eulogized as a visionary, a genius, a titan who had shaped the face of modern fashion. But behind the scenes, the reaction was less reverent and more pragmatic. Armand had been the agency. He had no children, no designated successor. His death created an immediate power vacuum and an existential crisis for the business he had built. Within weeks, it became clear that Armand Models, the institution, could not survive without Armand, the man. Lawyers descended, accountants pored over the books, and the decision was made. The agency would be dissolved, its assets liquidated, its roster of models absorbed by competitors. The iconic Soho loft building, perhaps the most valuable asset of all, was put up for sale. A frantic, almost brutal, clear-out began. Decades of fashion history, photographs, archives, client lists, and of course, Armand's legendary collection of vintage couture had to be sorted, cataloged, and either sold off or crated up for deep storage. The atmosphere in the once glamorous loft turned chaotic, mournful, awake for a dying empire. Franklin, the man who had quietly maintained this space for over 30 years, found himself overseeing the dismantling of the world he knew, packing up the ghosts of its past. His own retirement, once a distant dream, was now an imminent reality, hastened by the sudden collapse of his workplace. The clear-out of the Armand Models loft was a chaotic, often poignant affair. Racks of designer clothes were rolled away, boxes of photographs and archives were labeled and stacked, the very furniture that had witnessed decades of fashion history was carted off. Franklin moved through the emptying space, a quiet, somber figure overseeing the logistics. His heart heavy with the end of an era, even one as complicated and often troubling as Armand's. One final significant task remained. It was the one Franklin had been quietly dreading, clearing out Mr. Armand's private atelier. The room, locked since Armand's death, held not only the priceless vintage couture collection, but also its silent, unnerving centerpiece, the infamous Simone mannequin. The liquidators, practical, unsentimental men in suits, had specific instructions for the figure. It was deemed a potentially valuable asset, a unique piece of fashion art. It was to be carefully removed from its stand, packed into a custom-built, padded crate, and transported to a secure, climate-controlled storage facility pending appraisal and potential auction. The task of moving the figure itself fell, inevitably, to Franklin. He was the only one left who knew the room, the only one who had ever been regularly entrusted with its care. He unlocked the heavy insulated door one last time, the familiar rush of cool, chemically scented air washing over him. The room was exactly as he had always known it, meticulously ordered, eerily silent. The gowns hung in their bags, ghosts waiting for a ball that would never come. And in the center, under its soft spotlight, stood Simone, its lifelike gaze fixed on some distant, unseen point. Franklin approached the figure with a familiar sense of reluctance, mixed now with a strange, unexpected pang of something akin to sympathy. He had never liked the mannequin, had always found it creepy, unsettling. But now, seeing it standing alone in the soon-to-be dismantled sanctuary, it looked less like a monument to Armand's ego and more like another victim of his obsessive world, a fellow prisoner about to be moved from one gilded cage to another. He walked around the platform, assessing the best way to lift the figure. He knew from years of cleaning around it that it was anchored to the base somehow. He found the small, almost invisible release latches near the feet and carefully disengaged them. Now, the figure stood freestanding, balanced only by its own internal structure. It was time for the final, unpleasant task. He had to lift it, carry it the few feet to the large, waiting crate. He braced himself, placing his hands carefully on its waist and shoulders, preparing to move the silent, 20-year-old secret. Franklin positioned himself, bending his knees as he'd been taught, ready to lift the heavy, awkward weight of the mannequin. He gripped its waist and shoulders firmly and initiated the lift. He was immediately surprised by two things. First, the figure was far heavier than any normal mannequin should be, possessing a dense, solid weight that felt unnervingly substantial. Second, it was completely rigid, lacking the slight flexibility or give one would expect even from a high-quality fiberglass or resin form. It felt less like lifting a sculpture and more like trying to move a small, unyielding statue. He strained, his 70-year-old muscles protesting, and managed to hoist the figure a few inches off its stand. He took a shuffling step backwards, towards the waiting crate. But the figure's weight, combined with its absolute rigidity, made it incredibly difficult to balance. As he took a second step, his foot caught slightly on the edge of the plush carpet surrounding the platform. He stumbled, the figure tilted precariously in his arms. He tried to regain control, but its dead weight was too much. It slipped from his grasp, not crashing to the floor, but landing heavily, awkwardly, against the padded interior edge of the open crate. The impact wasn't loud, just a solid, dull thud. Franklin winced, expecting to see a crack, a chip, some damage to the priceless artwork. But the figure seemed unharmed. However, the jolt had dislodged something. The perfectly styled, dark hairpiece, the wig, had slipped, knocked askew by the impact, revealing the top edge of the form beneath. Franklin automatically reached out to straighten the wig, his janitor's instinct to restore order taking over. His fingers brushed against the exposed area just behind the figure's left ear, at the point where the hairline met the neck. He intended to simply nudge the wig back into place, but his fingers froze. Beneath the displaced edge of the wig, on the pale, smooth surface that he had always assumed was painted plastic or wax, was something else. Something small, pale, and distinctively curved. A scar. A small, crescent-shaped scar. Franklin's blood ran cold. He snatched his hand back as if burned. His mind, slow and methodical, began to race, flipping back through 20 years of memory. He saw a young woman, 19 years old, with a quiet smile and thoughtful eyes, pulling her hair back as she spoke to him by the water cooler. He saw the flash of that same, unique, crescent-shaped scar just behind her ear. Simone. He stared at the figure, at the askew wig, at the small, pale scar. It wasn't similar. It wasn't a coincidence. It was identical. The accidental slip, the dislodged wig. It was the breach. The tiny, random fissure in a 20-year-old facade that had just revealed an impossible, horrifying truth. Franklin felt a wave of dizziness wash over him, the cold, chemically scented air of the atelier suddenly feeling thick, suffocating. He leaned against the edge of the crate, his gaze locked on the figure, on the small, pale scar that had just ripped a hole in his reality. The scar. It was Simone's scar. He knew it. He remembered it. He forced himself to breathe, to push past the rising tide of panic and disbelief. He had to be sure. He had to know. Driven by a need that felt primal, urgent, he stepped closer to the figure again, his earlier revulsion replaced by a cold, forensic curiosity. He forced himself to look, truly look, at the object he had shared this room with for 20 years. The object he had so carefully, so deliberately, avoided examining too closely. He reached out a trembling hand, not towards the scar, but towards the figure's cheek. He pressed his fingertip against the surface. It was cool, yes, and firm. But it wasn't the hard, unyielding smoothness of plastic or fiberglass. It had a very slight give, a subtle yielding quality that felt disturbingly organic. And the texture. He looked closer, his eyes inches from the face. He could see them, tiny, almost invisible, but undeniably there. Pores. The surface wasn't perfectly smooth. It had the microscopic texture of real skin. His gaze dropped to the hands that had always unsettled him with their realism. He looked at the fingernails. They weren't just painted shapes. They had the distinct individual curves, the faint ridges, the pale moons at the base. He remembered Simone briefly showing him her nails once, laughing about how she could never keep polish on them because they grew in a slightly unique, curved shape. These were those nails. The chemical smell, the one Armand had dismissed as leather preservative, seemed stronger now, pungent, acrid, up close. It wasn't the smell of decay, it was the smell of arrested decay. Preservation. Franklin's mind, slow and steady, began to connect the dots, assembling the horrifying equation. The impossible realism, the scar, the skin texture, the fingernails, the persistent chemical odor. It wasn't a mannequin. It couldn't be. His gaze traveled back up the figure, his eyes scanning every detail, searching for confirmation, for denial, for anything to make sense of the monstrous thought forming in his mind. He looked at the hair, the edge still displaced. He realized with a new wave of nausea that it wasn't a wig. It was rooted, growing directly from the scalp, exhibiting the subtle variations in color and texture of real human hair. The unmasking was complete. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, written on the very surface of the object itself. The Simone mannequin was not a tribute. It was not a sculpture. It was Simone, the real Simone, preserved, kept, displayed. Franklin felt the floor tilt beneath him, the 20 years of quiet unease, of dismissed suspicions, coalescing into a single, blinding, horrifying moment of absolute certainty. Franklin stumbled back, his mind reeling, desperately trying to process the monstrous reality he had just uncovered. Simone, preserved. How? Why? The questions hammered at him, but his focus snagged on the how. The chemical smell, the preservation. It implied a process, an intervention. His gaze, now morbidly forensic, traveled back to the figure, searching for any sign, any clue that might explain the impossible state of the remains. He scanned the face, the neck, the exposed skin of the shoulders where the gown dipped low. Everything looked perfect, too perfect. The preservation was flawless, almost unnaturally so. There were no visible marks, no sutures, no signs of the kind of invasive procedures typically associated with embalming or taxidermy. Then, his eyes caught on a detail he had never noticed before, a detail deliberately obscured by the mannequin's costume. The figure was dressed in a high-collared, vintage couture gown, the fabric rising elegantly almost to the jawline, but in the slight crease where the neck met the collarbone, almost perfectly hidden by a fold of dark velvet, he saw it. A tiny, dark mark. He leaned in again, his breath held, his flashlight beam focused on the spot. It wasn't a mole or a freckle. It was too precise, too symmetrical for a natural imperfection. It was a small, almost perfectly circular mark, perhaps no bigger than the head of a pin, slightly indented, its edges clean and sharp. It looked like a puncture. A tiny, deliberate puncture point, strategically placed in an area that would be easily concealed by clothing or jewelry. What was it? An injection site, a drainage point. The implications were chilling. Had this mark been part of the process that had led to Simone's dark fate? Or was it part of the grotesque process that had preserved her afterwards, a clue to the method Armand had used to turn a person into an object? The mark was the final, horrifying punctuation mark on his discovery. It hinted at a level of cold, calculated, clinical precision that was even more terrifying than the initial shock of realizing the figure was human. This wasn't just an act of passion or obsession. It was an act of meticulous, methodical, and monstrous control. Armand hadn't just kept Simone. He had processed her, transforming her body with a chilling, detached artistry, leaving only this tiny, hidden signature of his terrible work. Franklin felt a wave of profound, visceral sickness wash over him. He couldn't stay in this room a second longer. He backed away, his eyes still fixed on the figure, on the hidden mark, the final, terrible clue. He turned and fled the atelier, leaving the heavy door swinging open behind him, the cool, chemically scented air pouring out into the hallway like a toxic secret finally escaping its confinement. Franklin stumbled out of the atelier and into the chaotic, brightly lit main space of the agency loft, his heart pounding, his mind a whirlwind of horror and disbelief. Movers and liquidators bustled around him, wrapping furniture in plastic, packing boxes, oblivious to the monstrous secret he had just uncovered in the room down the hall. He leaned against a wall, trying to catch his breath, trying to process the enormity of his discovery. Simone, preserved, displayed for 20 years, the chemical smell, the scar, the puncture mark. It was all real. Armand hadn't just been an eccentric, obsessive collector. He had been a monster, hiding his ultimate act of possession in the most audacious way imaginable, right under their noses, disguised as art. For 20 years, Franklin had lived with a quiet unease about that room, about that figure. He had accepted the lies, dismissed his own intuition, chosen the path of least resistance. He was just the janitor, after all. Who would have believed him? The weight of those 20 years of silence now pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. He thought of Simone, the vibrant, determined young woman he remembered. Her life cut short, her body turned into a grotesque trophy. He thought of her family, who likely still believed the cruel story Armand had spun about her running away, throwing her life away. He knew what he had to do. The fear was still there, fear of not being believed, fear of repercussions even now, fear of dredging up a past that powerful people might still want buried. But the horror of the truth, the profound injustice of Simone's fate, outweighed his fear. He owed it to her. He owed it to himself. Shaking, Franklin pulled out his old, battered cell phone. His first instinct was to call the agency manager overseeing the liquidation, but he stopped himself. No, this couldn't be handled internally. This wasn't an agency matter. It was a crime. A monstrous, 20-year-old crime. He scrolled through his contacts, past the numbers for his children, his church, his doctor. He found the number he was looking for, the main precinct line for the NYPD. He hesitated for only a second, took a deep, steadying breath, and pressed the call button. 911? No, non-emergency line, please, he said, his voice surprisingly calm, steady. Yes, I need to report. I need to report a discovery. At the old Armand Models building in Soho. It's about a mannequin. But it's not a mannequin. You need to send someone. Now. He gave the address, his name, and waited. The phone still pressed to his ear, his gaze drifting towards the open door of the atelier down the hall, where the cool, chemically scented air continued to bleed out into the chaotic, indifferent present. The 20-year silence, kept by a dead man's obsession and a janitor's quiet complicity, was finally, irrevocably, broken. The call for truth had been made.